I trust everyone is fine and doing very well. Now, contract discussions can be very boring, and consequently, it can make for a very good bedtime story. But hopefully, I managed to keep you awake and in the process to try and assist you in growing your knowledge on contracts. If not, then please listen to this clip to soothe you to sleep during the week or weekends. The session will provide examples of matters which are very, very much relevant to our industry and which I have experienced either directly or indirectly through colleagues of mine. So we will go through it and hopefully we can assist you in increasing your knowledge on contracts. Right, I'm sure that you first want to know who you are dealing with. My name is Johan Viljoen. I'm a quantity surveyor by trade, and I have studied through the University of the Free State from 1996 to finished in 1999 and started my full-time career in 2000. I have been on construction sites for about 75% for the past 22 years. So I've been directly involved in construction matters, projects, and I have worked in 8 different countries, either on a bespoke contract or the general conditions of contract in that specific country. And these projects varied from a few million rand up to 650 million US, which at the time was about, call it 7 billion rand. So it was quite an experience for me on each and every project. Currently, I am working for Ukutumbeka Construction Cost Consultants, which is in short UCCC. I'm the commercial lead and I'm dealing with commercial aspects, disputes, claims for various clients. I have acted as expert witness in arbitration case, and I am also an arbitrator myself. Okay, so contracts and contract discussions are generally perceived to be very boring and also not that important until the day when that licorice hits the fan. Then it is just chaos. Parties running around, thinking what to do, strategize, and so on. But the question normally is, can this be cleaned up? Can this licorice against the wall be cleaned? And I normally say there's a definite yes and a definite no. And it is all dependent on the specific situation, the circumstances, what happened, what communications is within the possession of each party. So the old saying of prevention is better than cure. I'm a strong believer in that. I believe most of the disputes can be prevented. Not all of them, but most of them. But I must also ask each and everybody of you, please do not prevent all the disputes, because then guys like me in the industry will not have any work. In South Africa, some of the mining houses, the coal mines, are using their own bespoke contracts, their general conditions, but the general population and industry uses the GCC, JBCC, the FIDIC, and also the NEC. Now, when I started as a quantity surveyor, although it's part of the curriculum, I did not understand exactly how these general conditions, how they fit into the project, how the clauses needs to be read, how it needs to be interpreted, and how it obviously it affects the money aspect of the project. I did not understand that at all. So when I started, companies normally, if there was a claim, a contractual claim and extension of time that had to be agreed, they agreed it on a packet of stylus and 30s. These days, and I think everybody will know and have experienced it, these days it doesn't work like it. These days it's much more contractual. Your paperwork, administration needs to be in place. So those days are long gone. And in dealing with most of these matters contractually, it did in a way put the relationships on the back burner, if I can call it that. And I'm not saying it's not, relationships is not important. It's very important on projects. But at the end of the day, as in the old days, the relationships doesn't have an effect, and it shouldn't have an effect on a contractual claim outcome. The contractual claim outcome needs to be whatever is written in the contract and what was initially agreed. So parties enter into a contract to obviously protect each right and entitlement they have, how it was agreed, and if you don't abide by the contract, obviously the contract is then not necessary, and if something happens, then there will be just chaos on how to deal with it, how you need to run with it. Will you be entitled? Not entitled? All those things comes into play. So it's important to abide by the contract for both parties. So during the project life, there's obviously stumbling blocks, there's disagreements between the parties, and normally the general conditions is set up in such a way to make it clear, or at least hint into a direction of how it needs to be dealt with. So the parties these days are much more contractual than it was a couple of years ago when I started off many moons ago. So it is much more contractual. Each party needs to abide by the contract, do what he needs to do, not do what he mustn't do, and so on. And everything on the project is these days about the bottom line. So if these stumbling blocks and the disputes can be reduced, minimized, prevented to an extent, obviously that will benefit, I think, both parties, especially also the contractor, because disputes for both parties, it does cost money. And sometimes it costs a lot of money, especially when you need to go through adjudication process, arbitration, sometimes into litigation. It becomes in plain English, becomes a slap. So I'm going to read a couple of questions to you, and I'm very sure you've either asked the question yourself or encountered a question from someone else about it. So just going to read a couple to you. These two clauses contradict each other, so which one takes preference? This clause is highly unfair to me and surely cannot be applied in the true sense of the word. My contract does not expressly deal with latent defects, period. What is this period? My accepted program states the day when the employer needs to provide me with free issue material. Must I submit a notification if the employer fails to provide me the material on site? Do I have a valid contract? Terms and conditions, is it the same thing? What is a non-variation clause? Will it affect me? I received a letter of intent. Surely the contract is awarded to me. And so I can go on with questions that either was raised to me or colleagues of mine, and which you need to deal with. And everything is also dependent on which contract you've got, is the particulars in it, and so on. So for me to understand all these things, and as you by now know, I'm an Afrikaans guy. So to understand the English, how it's written, to interpret it, for me, the only way was to put pen to paper. And we developed, UCCC developed courses in dealing with some of these issues. Now, the courses start with common law, how common law deals with the contract in the construction industry. The next course then moves on to the law of contract, which we specifically deal with things like terms and conditions, what is it, non-variation clauses, and so on. And thereafter, we tackle a general conditions of contract. We see how that specific contract deals with the common law aspect of it, how it deals with the law of contract of it. And then the fourth one, we do a comparison between the GCCs on specific matters, on insurance, on payment certificates, on instructions, how each contract deals with it, because the contracts deals in it in different ways, and it must be understood to deal with it correctly on the projects. But in this discussion for today, I will have a look at just to have a general discussion of payment, how common law deals with it, how the law of contract deals with payment issue, and how the general conditions of contracts deals with it. I think it will then become clear why a payment clause is written in the way it is. So after the payment example, we will look at some case studies to illustrate certain general principles. But I also want to ask you, please contact us. We can provide you with a quotation to either do a course or courses for you virtually, or we can do it in person. So let's first start with payment. Okay, so the common law principle with regards to payment is that the contractor can only receive payment when he has completed the works. So immediately we can see that in the construction building environment, this poses a huge problem, as no contractor that I know can complete a 20 million, 50 million, 100 million plus contract and wait for payment until the completion of the works. So that in essence is a huge problem. If we look at the law of contract, and let's assume that there is a contract between two parties, contractor needs to construct a fence around the house, but the agreement does not expressly state how payment and when payment will be made by the client. So it will be seen that this contract has reciprocal obligations, and it will boil down to he needs to complete the works, the contractor needs to complete the works before he will receive payment from the client. So it is very much in relation to, in this instance, of what the common law principle is. As we know, the GCCs expressly deals with payments on how and when the contractor will receive payment from its client. In essence and in short, it is interim payments. So an interim payment is in effect an advance on the payment when works are completed, although the value is based on work done to date. I think what is also important to mention is that if a contract states the following: payment only when works are accepted and approved. This in essence means then that when you receive payment for that works, it is accepted and approved, unless there may be other conditions in the contract that supersedes this specific provision. Okay, so let's look at a case study. I think you will find this one very interesting. This case study is based on an event that happened in 2021 on a project that I was involved with. It was a NEC4 Option A contract, so June 2017 with amendments of October 2020. So as we know, the Option A is a design and construct - lump sum contract. So I'm going to read the case study and then we will take it from there. So the client provided a routing of services, which was electrical and fiber, with the tender documents. The tenderer had to offer a lump sum price for the execution. The one tenderer elected not to use this routing received from the client and provided an amended routing, and based on its financial offer on this amended routing, because it was shorter of that of the client and therefore cheaper. The client and tenderer commenced with negotiations and the contract was concluded and signed. The price was that of the tender submitted based on the shorter route, and the client's routing remained in the document. Therefore, no drawings of the amended route was included in the contract, although it formed part of the tenderer's offer and price. So now, if we first ask the question and say, what routing must the contractor construct to? Was it that of the client or that of the tenderers or the contractor's one, the amended route? First off, it does seem like a gray area, but if we go and we break it down into smaller pieces, smaller chunks, it will become clear that it's not gray at all. So first, let's see what we need to look at, what was included in the contract. In other words, what forms part of the contract as a matter of fact. So what we know definitely, when the contract was signed, there's a price in, let's say it's 100 Rand, and the layout drawings as per the client's routes were included and not that of the tenderers. So those two things we know as a matter of fact. Then the next question we can ask is, can it be interpreted that the tenderer's routing is included into the contract, as it is clear that the accepted price is based on the shorter route and that there were extensive discussions regarding these routes? In other words, can it be implied that as a result of the price that was accepted, which was obviously based on the shorter route, does it not imply that the routing of the contractor is then part of the contract? So if we look at clause 12.3 of the NEC 4 contract of the general conditions, this clause reads as follows: no change to the contract unless provided for by these conditions of contract has effect unless it has been agreed, confirming it in writing and signed by the parties. So this is known as a non-variation clause. So that just says that the contract is the contract unless the parties, after the signature of the contract, agrees to a specific change, it's put into writing and signed by both parties. Then it becomes part of the contract. Also, we also need to take cognizance of the fact that the following clause was also signed into the contract. I'm going to read it to you. By the duly authorized representatives signing this schedule of deviations below, the client and the tenderer agree to and accept this schedule of deviations as the only deviations from and amendments to the documents listed in the tender data and any addenda thereto listed in the tender schedules, as well as any confirmation, clarification, or changes to the terms of the offer agreed by the tenderer and the client during the process of offer and acceptance. So if you take 12.3 and this deviation schedule together, it's very clear that the contract is the contract, whatever is signed into it. And the shorter routes were not signed into the contract at all. So this is clear that the, let's call it the scope that needs to be executed is in accordance with the routing of the client. So if you say that, if it is argued in a way that, but the price that was accepted was based on the shorter route. So surely then it seems unfair. But if you argue it this way, the parole evidence rule will come into play. Now, the parole evidence rule, in essence, states that it's when parties have reduced their agreement to writing, intending that the document, in other words, the contract, to be an integration of all that was gone before, and hence the sole memorial of the agreement. No other evidence is admissible to contradict, vary, add to, or subtract from the terms in the writing. So it's very clear that whatever is signed into the contract is the contract. That's the price based on that specific scope, and that's it. In essence, there's no ways around it. So it may seem unfair, but that lower price which the contractor or tenderer offered was included in the contract based on the scope with the client's routing. So therefore, the contractor, in essence, lost this case. Case study 2 is based on certain principles of program and free issue materials. So let's have a look at it. Okay, so this case study, it says, based on a hypothetical scenario. It's a FIDIC 1999 Red Book contract. So let's just read the case study. A signed contract includes a high-level program indicating major activities with milestones or key dates and the completion date, all as per the contract data or appendix to tender. The contract expressly includes the provision: the employer shall supply the contractor with the necessary steel segments for the pipe bridge for structure A1 at no cost. This includes the delivery of the said steel segments to site. So in other words, free issue, free delivery, no additional cost to the contractor. The contractor in its program indicated this delivery of free issue steel segments to be on 9 May 2022. The employer or the client fails to make delivery on this date and delivers it on 30 May 2022. The work is on the critical path. On 10 May 2022, the contractor submits a notice to claim in accordance with clause 20.1 and submits a fully detailed claim on 3 June 2022. The engineer rejects the claim and argues that the contractor did not provide him, her, or the employer with a notice of when the steel segments are required. So first things first, let's have a look at what common law states in connection with a program. So in general, the program is not intended to reflect contractual obligations regarding the time as performance on the part of any party, the subcontractor, contractor, or employer, unless it is clear that this was the intention of the parties. And why, and the reason for this is that if there is a deviation from the start or completion dates on any activity shown on the program, that would constitute a breach of the party or that specific party. So in normal circumstances, the only so-called contractual dates shall be the commencement date, the milestone or key dates, and the completion date, as these are the dates that's included in the appendix to tender or in some way or some form in the contract. And obviously these appendix to tender or contract data forms an integral part of the signed agreement and not the program. So in simple terms, the program is only there to illustrate how the contractor intends to execute his works, and it also provides a meaningful document of how to calculate extension of time. So if we look at a contract, it is clear that if a contract does not include a fixed date for performance, so in this case for the steel segments there was not a specific date, the party that is owed the performance must demand that specific performance. If you do not demand that specific performance, you are not entitled to that specific performance because it's not part of the contract dates, although it has an effect on your completion date or key date. So if there's no time fixed for the performance, like in this instance with the steel segments, it must be within a reasonable time. So the demand that you make must be specific, it must be detailed of what is required, when it is required, by when it is required, and obviously it must be within a reasonable time. So reasonable time will differ from situation to situation, as for example steel segments, which is obviously a long lead item, reasonable time will not be 1 week. So if the demand is made and that's the party does not perform, which is specified in the demand on the date that it's demand, then you would be in mora, you would be in breach. If we look at clause 8.3 of the FIDIC Red Book, the second last paragraph states the following: the contractor shall promptly give notice to the engineer of specific probable future events or circumstances which may adversely affect the work, increase the contract price, or delay the execution of the works. So my understanding is that this contractual provision can be used as a notification in this instance. As long as that communication is made in reasonable time, it states what is required and by when. So it's advisable that this communication must be submitted very early, as the steel structures are most probably long lead items. So this needs to be done very early in the contract. Date needs to be specified of when this is required, as the contractor would be aware of that this, because it's on the critical path, it will delay his completion date or key dates if he does not provide specific a detailed communication of demand for specific performance. So I think in short is, yes, the employer was not put into breach, and it's a valid argument, or at least for part of it. This brings us to the end of the session. I trust that you have enjoyed it. Please make contact with us if we can be of any assistance or give some advice. Thank you.